In the late afternoon, under the warm glow of the southern sun, a horrifying scene unfolded. Sam Taylor, a black veteran who had bravely served his country, was violently assaulted by Officer Hank Murdoch in broad daylight. With one swift, brutal punch, Murdoch struck Sam down, sending him crashing to the ground, unconscious, as a shocked crowd looked on in disbelief. The people gathered around were frozen, stunned by the sudden, unprovoked act of violence against a man so widely respected in their community. Sam had only been walking home, his 70-year-old frame still upright and proud from years of military discipline. He was a figure known and respected around town, a man who had endured the hardships of war, only to return and live a quiet life, serving his neighbors and contributing in countless small ways. But today, on his familiar route through the town square, Sam had encountered Officer Murdoch, who was already engaged in a tense confrontation with a young black man. As Sam drew closer, he could sense the hostility in Murdoch's stance, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. The young man appeared terrified, his hands shaking as he struggled to comply with the officer's harsh demands. Sam's instinct, honed through years of service and resilience, urged him to intervene. "Is everything all right here, officer?" Sam asked, his voice steady and calm, hoping to de-escalate the situation. But Murdoch's head snapped in his direction, his expression turning icy. "Keep walking, Taylor," he barked, his tone sharp and hostile. "This is none of your business." Sam, however, wasn't about to back down. He had faced down far worse than an angry officer, and he wasn't about to let this situation spiral into something worse. He looked Murdoch squarely in the eyes and said, "It doesn't look like the boy's causing any trouble. Why don't you let him go?" That challenge was more than Murdoch could handle. Rage flashed across his face, and without a moment's hesitation, he swung his fist, landing a brutal punch across Sam's face. The crowd gasped in horror as Sam's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless and still. In the tense silence that followed, bystanders began to pull out their phones, recording the tragic scene and calling for help. Sirens wailed in the distance as an ambulance was called, but the damage had been done. Sam Taylor, a man who had risked his life for his country, now lay motionless, his life hanging by a thread because of one officer's unchecked aggression. The incident was soon all over social media, sparking outrage across the town and beyond. What had started as an ordinary day had turned into a community tragedy, igniting a movement for justice that would soon shake the town to its core. David Taylor was deep in his work when the phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. The lawyer had been reviewing case files, immersed in his mission of standing up for those often overlooked by the justice system. The buzzing phone sat on his desk, vibrating insistently until he finally answered, his mind still halfway on the documents in front of him. "Mr. Taylor." The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost fragile. "This is Mercy General Hospital. We have an emergency concerning your father, Sam Taylor." David's heart stopped. The words hung in the air, refusing to fully sink in. His father, a strong, unbreakable presence in his life, a man who had survived wars and hardship, was now lying in a hospital, the victim of a senseless act of violence. He listened as the nurse on the line gave him the details, her voice gentle but urgent. "Your father was assaulted in the town square," she explained. "He's in a coma, Mr. Taylor. We're doing everything we can, but the situation is critical." In a heartbeat, David's focus shifted from the cases on his desk to the well-being of his father. He barely muttered a word as he ended the call, his mind racing. For a moment, he simply sat there, staring at the walls of his office, trying to process the enormity of what he had just heard. His father, the man who had taught him resilience and compassion, was now fighting for his life because of a brutal assault at the hands of a police officer. Grabbing his coat, David rushed out of his office, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anger. By the time he reached the hospital, night had fallen, and the air was thick with tension. In the lobby, he could see a few familiar faces. friends of his father, members of the veteran community who had gathered upon hearing the news. Their faces were etched with worry and grief, a reflection of the deep respect they all held for Sam. A nurse led David to his father's room, her expression sympathetic as she gestured toward the still figure lying on the bed. Machines beeped rhythmically, keeping pace with Sam's shallow breaths. David's eyes traced the familiar lines of his father's face, now bruised and swollen from the assault. It was a sight that sent a surge of fury through him. He took a deep breath, his fists clenched as he stood by his father's bedside. This was not something he could ignore. Whoever was responsible would have to answer for what they had done, not only to his father, but to everyone who had ever faced similar injustice. As he stood there, David felt the weight of his duty as both a son and a lawyer. His father had always instilled in him a sense of responsibility toward those who couldn't defend themselves. And now, Sam was the one who needed justice. Stepping back from his father's bedside, David's mind sharpened with a singular focus. This was no ordinary case, no minor infraction that could be brushed aside. He would launch a full investigation into the officer who had done this, the department that had allowed him to act without consequence, and the system that had failed to protect his father and others like him. Back at his office, David began his relentless pursuit of evidence. The videos of the incident were already circulating online, each one capturing the brutality of the attack, the officer's unchecked rage, and the stunned reactions of the witnesses. As he watched the footage, he felt a renewed surge of determination. This was not just about his father. It was about every person who had been marginalized, every injustice that had been swept under the rug. David's team worked tirelessly, gathering testimonies, records, and complaints that had been filed against Officer Hank Murdoch. The evidence painted a disturbing picture of a man who had used his badge as a shield to hide his abusive behavior. Records showed a long history of complaints, incidents involving excessive force, racial profiling, and harassment, many of which had been conveniently ignored by the department. As the night wore on, David realized that his father's assault was just the tip of the iceberg. The system that had allowed Officer Murdoch to operate with impunity was deeply flawed, rooted in prejudice and corruption. His father's case had sparked a fire within him, a relentless drive to expose the truth, no matter how deep it ran. But David knew this wouldn't be easy. The department had a long-standing culture of silence, protecting its own at the expense of justice. Yet, he also knew that he had something they couldn't ignore, a community that was outraged, a story that was spreading, and a resolve that wouldn't waver. The clock ticked past midnight, but David continued his work, fueled by a sense of duty and the love he had for his father. He would stop at nothing to ensure that the people responsible were held accountable and that his father's sacrifice would not be in vain. As the first light of dawn crept into the town, word of the incident had already spread far and wide. By morning, news outlets were reporting on the story, headlines calling attention to the brutal assault on Sam Taylor, a respected war veteran, by Officer Hank Murdoch. The video footage taken by bystanders had gone viral, sparking outrage across social media. People everywhere were demanding answers, and the once quiet town had become the focal point of a growing national conversation about justice and accountability. David knew that he needed to act quickly. The attention on the case was both a blessing and a curse. It gave him the momentum to push for change, but it also meant that every move he made would be under intense scrutiny. As he walked back into his office that morning, he was met by his team, who had worked through the night gathering evidence and preparing the initial case. "David," one of his associates began, her voice tense, "we've pulled up Officer Murdoch's record. It's worse than we thought. There are multiple complaints against him, excessive force, racial bias, misconduct, but almost all of them were dismissed or never made it to review." David took the file, flipping through the pages with a grim expression. It was a damning record, one that painted a clear picture of a man who had been allowed to abuse his power with little consequence. The reports were detailed, filled with accounts from victims who had experienced Murdoch's violent and discriminatory behavior firsthand. And yet each complaint had been quietly dismissed, swept under the rug by a system designed to protect its own. "This isn't just about Murdoch," David said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "This is about an entire system that's been complicit in covering up his actions. We're going to expose every single person who allowed this to happen." He called a meeting with his legal team, laying out the strategy for the case. They would not only file charges against Murdoch, but also seek to hold the police department accountable for its role in enabling his misconduct. David's plan was to bring this case into the public eye, to make sure that the town, and the entire nation, understood the depth of the corruption that had allowed officers like Murdoch to operate unchecked. As David laid out his strategy, a sense of purpose filled the room. His team was motivated, inspired by his determination and the strength of the evidence they had gathered. They understood that this was more than just a case. It was a fight for justice, not only for Sam Taylor, but for everyone who had suffered under a system that seemed immune to accountability. But David knew that he couldn't do this alone. He reached out to community leaders, activists, and organizations that had been fighting for police reform, asking for their support. He wanted this case to be more than just a legal battle. He wanted it to spark a movement, to inspire people to stand up and demand real change. As the day progressed, David held a press conference outside his office, addressing a crowd of reporters and members of the community who had gathered to hear his statement. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward him as he stepped up to the podium. "My father, Sam Taylor, is a man who served this country with honor," David began, his voice clear and resolute. "He spent his life fighting for the values we hold dear: justice, equality, and freedom. But yesterday, those values were violated in the most brutal way imaginable. Officer Hank Murdoch's actions were not just an assault on my father. They were an assault on everything he stood for." David paused, allowing his words to sink in. The crowd was silent, their attention fixed on him as he continued. "We will not rest until those responsible are held accountable. This is not just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that has failed to protect its citizens, a system that has allowed officers like Murdoch to operate without fear of consequences. We are calling for a full investigation into the police department, and we will not stop until justice is served." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices raised in solidarity with David's cause. Reporters shouted questions, eager to learn more about the case and the evidence his team had uncovered. But David remained focused, his gaze steady as he promised the community that he would not back down. As the press conference ended, David felt a renewed sense of determination. The fight was just beginning, but he was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He knew that his father's story had struck a chord with people, that his fight for justice was a cause that others could rally around. Back at his office, David's phone buzzed with messages of support from people across the country, each one a reminder that he was not alone in this battle. The world was watching, and he was ready to make sure that justice would finally be served. As the days passed, the town's small police department found itself under intense scrutiny. The pressure was mounting, and the once shielded secrets of its internal workings began to unravel. Officer Hank Murdoch had been placed on administrative leave, a temporary measure that did little to calm the growing outrage. Protests were now a daily occurrence, with townspeople gathering outside the police station, holding signs demanding justice for Sam Taylor and an end to unchecked police brutality. Inside his office, David Taylor sat surrounded by files, statements, and mounting evidence. His legal team had been working tirelessly, combing through every report, every complaint that had ever been filed against Murdoch. What they found was staggering, a long, ugly trail of abuse that had been quietly buried by the department. Each new piece of evidence fueled David's resolve, making it clear that his father's case was not isolated, but part of a deeply rooted problem. One afternoon, David received a call from a whistleblower, an officer within the department who had seen enough. The voice on the other end of the line was nervous, hesitant, but determined to help. "I've seen what's been happening," the officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stay silent anymore. There are files, internal memos, things that were swept under the rug to protect Murdoch and others like him. The chief knew about it. The whole department did. They just looked the other way." David's heart raced as he listened, knowing this was the breakthrough he needed. With the whistleblower's information, they could now prove that the corruption went far beyond one rogue officer. It was an entire system that had enabled and protected Murdoch's misconduct. The whistleblower agreed to provide evidence and testify, despite the risks he faced from within the department. Armed with this new evidence, David called for a second press conference, this time outside the courthouse. The crowd was larger than before, and the mood was charged with anticipation. Reporters and community members alike watched with rapt attention as David stepped up to the podium. "Today, we are taking the first steps toward accountability," David announced, his voice unwavering. "We have uncovered evidence of systemic corruption within this police department, a culture of silence that has allowed certain officers to act without consequence. Officer Hank Murdoch's actions were not isolated. They were part of a larger pattern of misconduct that has been hidden from public view for far too long." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in. "We are calling for a full investigation, not only into Murdoch's conduct, but into every officer, every leader within this department who allowed these injustices to continue. We will not rest until every person responsible is brought to justice." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices echoing through the streets. David's message resonated deeply, touching a nerve that had been exposed by years of silence and complicity. People were fed up, and for the first time, they felt that change was within reach. As David stepped away from the podium, he felt the weight of his responsibility more than ever. This was no longer just about his father. It was about an entire community that had been failed by those sworn to protect them. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges from those who would try to protect the status quo. But he was ready for the fight. Back in his office, David's team began the grueling work of preparing the case. The whistleblower's testimony was crucial, and they had to handle it with extreme care. They coordinated with other activists and legal experts, forming a coalition that would not only bring Murdoch and his enablers to justice, but also push for reforms that would prevent such abuses from happening again. That night, as David walked home, he felt a sense of hope mingled with the weight of the battle ahead. His father's life hung in the balance, but his legacy, the principles he had instilled in David, were stronger than ever. This fight for justice, sparked by one act of brutality, had grown into a movement, a beacon for those who had endured similar injustices but had never seen their stories told. David knew there would be resistance, that those in power would not relinquish control easily, but he also knew that this was a fight worth every ounce of strength he had, for his father, for the community, and for the countless others who had been silenced. David would see this through to the end. Months passed, and the court proceedings against Officer Hank Murdoch and the implicated police officials finally drew to a close. The courtroom was filled with townspeople, activists, and reporters who had followed every twist and turn of the case. After a series of testimonies, compelling evidence, and powerful statements from community members, the verdict was announced. Murdoch was found guilty of excessive force, misconduct, and aggravated assault. The implicated officials who had covered up his actions faced charges, with the police chief resigning amid growing public pressure. Outside the courthouse, David Taylor stood before a crowd that had gathered to witness this moment. The community's victory was bittersweet. Sam Taylor was still recovering, his health forever altered by the assault. But his story, and the courage of those who demanded accountability, had sparked a wave of change. David addressed the crowd with words that were both hopeful and cautionary. Justice isn't just a word, it's a commitment. Today, we won a battle, but the fight to build a just society continues. Our system must protect everyone, without exception, regardless of race, background, or status. We cannot allow prejudice to go unchallenged, or silence to protect wrongdoing. He paused, looking at the faces of those who had supported his family through the ordeal. The actions we took were necessary, but they were only possible because a community came together to demand accountability. This is what true progress looks like. A shared responsibility to hold ourselves and each other accountable. Each one of us plays a role, whether it's speaking out against injustice, supporting those affected, or pushing for systemic reform. The message resonated with everyone present. For months, they had seen how unity could drive change, how a community's voice, when raised in unison, could tear down barriers of corruption and oppression. Local organizations began working closely with the reformed police department, holding workshops on racial sensitivity, accountability, and community protection, aiming to bridge the gap that had existed between officers and the people they served. In time, the town transformed, becoming a model of civic responsibility and mutual respect. Sam Taylor's name became a symbol, not just of resilience, but of the power of a united community standing against injustice. His story reminded everyone that when individuals come together, they could confront even the most deeply rooted issues. As David closed his speech, he left the crowd with a simple yet powerful message. We all have a duty to create a world where justice is not an exception, but the rule. Let's continue to work toward that world, not just for ourselves, but for future generations.